Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the SSAT Research Committee sponsored webinar entitled Key Elements of Setting Up a Research Laboratory. In this webinar, we're going to have three focuses. The first is going over elements of a successful surgical research laboratory. The second is how to plan ahead when searching for your first faculty position as a surgeon scientist. And the third is how to seek guidance from scientific and surgical mentors. We have three outstanding speakers over the next hour here. We have Dr. Jason Siklik from UCSD. We have Dr. Andrew Loewy from UCSD. And we have Dr. Nita Huja from Yale University. So we'll run the seminar with all the speakers presenting their talks, and we'll save about 12 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please place them in the chat function, and Dr. Kaitan, my co-moderator, or myself will address them at the end of the session. So our first speaker is Dr. Jason Siklik. Dr. Siklik is from the University of California at San Diego. He's a professor of surgery in the Division of Surgical Oncology, the executive vice chair of research and co-leader of the sarcoma disease team at UCSD. He's an NIH-funded surgeon scientist, and he's going to give our first talk entitled, "What are the elements of a startup package?" Dr. Siklik.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present tonight. So as Dr. Khan mentioned, my presentation tonight will be on what are the elements of a startup package. And I'll start off by pointing out the fact that Dr. Cameron always used to say to us when we were training, if you find a job that you love, you'll never have to work another day in your life. And I think this is absolutely true. But the caveat that there is obviously no perfect job, and there's also going to be no perfect startup package. So take all these things with you know, in the context of your individual practice and your individual program. But these are sort of overview points that I'll talk about this evening. So just as by way of an overview of the key elements of a startup package, there's really three main components that I'll talk about tonight. The first is general support from the department or the institution. The second is startup funds and space. And then the third is salary, insurance, retirement, and other benefits. And I point out here that all these items and customs will vary widely by the institution. So be cognizant of this as you're thinking about startup packages in the future. So the first portion will be on general support from the department or the institution. So I've listed out 8 different components here to be thinking about as you're negotiating your general support from the department or an institution. And these are obviously all going to vary a little bit by the by your situation and by your department. But obviously, things you need to be thinking about moving from left to right include your administrative support. So whether it's administrative assistant, an OR scheduler, you need to be thinking about your office space. You need to be asking about questions like, is this going to be a single office or a shared office? What's the situation in terms of furniture or paint? The next thing to be asking about, or that should be in your package, would be access to computers and software. Often, obviously, these days, you have your office with a desktop. You might have a laptop as well for travel. And you might have both. So again, something to include and to think about. Another aspect is the travel membership and dues. Here at UC San Diego, we call it the TMD. This is obviously supports going to meetings, paying for your memberships to societies, et cetera. And as you can imagine, this can get fairly costly. And so having departmental or institutional support is important for this. On the bottom row there, you can see other things to be thinking about in terms of starting up your practice and your startup package, being clinical support, whether it's an APP, a nurse, or perhaps both, whether you're going to have core access to core facilities, shared research equipment or resources. You need to be thinking about students or residents that may be funded by the department through training grants, for instance, or other support such as grant or scientific writers, biostatisticians, as appropriate for your program. The next thing to be thinking about is the startup funds in the space, and I'm going to spend some more time on this section. So the first aspect of this research startup fund structure is whether this is going to be a lump sum versus an annual amount. And every institution and every package may be a little bit different. The other important aspect is how long is this going to last for? So there's often a defined number of years, but there may be stipulations on the funding renewal that's based upon perhaps productivity, or maybe stipulations based upon unspent money that is left over at the end of the year. So it's important to spell all these aspects out and have these clearly defined when you're working on your startup package. So it's not a matter of, the person that gets the most money wins. It's really a matter of getting enough to cover your costs until you can generate enough revenue stream in order to support your program. So what do you need to be thinking about in terms of the elements that you need to be able to support? If you've got a basic science laboratory, you need to be thinking about reagents. You need to be thinking about equipment, whether it be expensive one-time costs, or you may need to think about sharing equipment. And so again, finding out what is available institution locally within your building or beyond in order to support what you need to do. Staff can be incredibly expensive. Roughly, if you add a technician, a grad student, and a postdoc, you're talking roughly about $150,000 per year. So it's something to be thinking about to negotiate. And this is not a one-time deal. This is something that's a recurring cost every year. So you need to be taking that into account when you're thinking about how much money you need for staff to support your program. In addition, what you're going to need to be thinking about is fund managers. So you're going to need somebody that's going to help you with managing the money in terms of your pre-award as well as your post-award money for your grants as you develop funding, but also just how to manage your funding that you have from your startup package. So how long does this last? Well, the until is really going to be variable based upon the institution and your negotiation. But often it's somewhere lasts in the order of about 3 to 5 years, probably closer to 3 years in most situations. But you need to also be thinking about whether you're going to have discretion of how you're going to spend the money, or again, if there's going to be stipulations on how unspent money is left, whether it's going to be left on the table or whether it's something that you can carry over to the following years. And finally, you need to be asking about, if you obtain a grant, do you lose your startup funding? Ideally, if you're doing a good job at negotiating, you'll be able to keep that money in addition to the money that you obtain with the grant. So in terms of what you're going to be thinking about in your startup package, first off is laboratory space. So in space is money. So you need to be thinking about, there's got to be money to support electricity and telephones and the internet. These obviously all aren't free. They have associated costs with them. You need to be thinking about negotiating for space, which can sometimes be a little bit difficult. It may involve even potentially trying to find space for you to barter with another department to put you in a location that's close to collaborators. And so it's not just a given that you're going to have a position in a certain building. You also need to be thinking about or asking about quantity, quality, and the location. These things are also important, not only relative to potentially to mentors and collaborators, but also relative to your clinic, the hospital, the operating room, your office, et cetera. And then finally, I have their condition of the lab space. Obviously, lab space that's in disrepair or is in need of renovations is significantly different than lab space that is immediately usable. You also obviously want to have space that's a fit for your research program. Putting you into bench space, for instance, that has a bunch of chemical fume hoods when you never use those in your program is sort of wasted space. So again, you need to be asking about that. And then finally, as I mentioned before, location, what relative to neighbors. And this actually may be more important in a lot of situations to think about and to ask about than just the quantity. More is not always better. Well, how much do you expect to get? So somewhere in general for most startup packages is about 250 to 500, what are called assignable square feet, or ASFs, is the typical nomenclature that's used in most institutions. You need to be thinking about asking for animal space if appropriate and how that is located relative to your bench space. And if possible, you need to try to see the space yourself before you sign on the dotted line, just because obviously going back to that prior slide, there can be a lot of nuances and a lot of potential variables there. And finally, what you want to do is make sure that space agreement is written into your official offer letter. And even with the caveat that even if it's in writing, don't assume it's, everything's finalized until you are there. What about equipment? So you're going to need equipment, and you may be asked even early on in your interviews what equipment you need. Even if they don't ask you what equipment you need for your program, you need to be thinking about that on your own. And whether that be from your own time as a postdoc, or thinking about or looking at other recent candidates lists of examples of equipment that they needed, you need to put together a summary of what you're going to need, whether it be, again, as part of your negotiation, or using money that you have in your negotiation to purchase whatever consumables or small equipment that you're going to need, pipettes or pipette men or flasks, etc., in order to run your laboratory. And finally, there can be high cost items, and you need to be sort of judicious about this and think about this. Some are going to be, there can be obviously things like flow cytometers that are incredibly expensive, but they may be something that is important for your group and for your program, but maybe something that can be shared. And so you need to ask about these and do some investigations as you're negotiating your startup package. And then the last part I'll mention here is the key elements of a startup package is the salary, insurance, retirement, and other benefits. Now, I've sort of tiered these into two tiers. Tier one is obviously salary, and you need to be asking about what is guaranteed versus how much is dependent upon your clinical volume or your research volume. The other aspect of the salary that should be defined in your startup package negotiation is whether there's bonus incentives. And if not within the first couple of years, when do those potentially start? The other really important thing to be thinking about is protected time. How much, and for how long. You don't want to set up a situation where at the end of a year, if you're not funded, you have no protected time. So you need to be asking about these. Again, it's expected that generally your clinical volume will be low as you start and will ramp up with time. But you need to be also cognizant of what your work RVU targets are going to be annually, and whether this is going to be expected to increase to a given target often at the end of year 3. You should also be asking about committee service requirements and teaching requirements. And then the other important factor is, what is the metric of your success? Is it time to your K funding? Is it reaching your RVU targets and your K funding? You need to be sort of cognizant of the nuances of what is a measures of your success. The other important things to think about in a negotiator are a mentorship plan and a mentorship committee. None of us can do this alone. This is something that it's really important to have a mentor that is supportive of you, and that can help you in terms of your clinical program as well as your research program, and how to meld those two together. And it often takes multiple people. And so as you're developing things like your K awards applications, you're going to want to be thinking about a mentorship committee for that. And a few other things here: start date can obviously be negotiated, and then moving expenses and house hunting visits should be part of your negotiation. Now, what things I have listed here is tier 2. A lot of these are less likely to be, or perhaps in your next group of, what's level of importance. And some of these may shift depending upon the individual person. Things like housing, some institutions may have housing assistance or housing loans available. Not all do. There may be potential for salary advance if needed, if you need support in order to help you with your moving costs and getting your family up and running in the new location. You need to be thinking about if you've got a spouse or a partner that needs another an appointment, or a dual career family. How's that going to play out? And so that should certainly be a factor. Whether you're going to ask for a graduate program affiliation, for instance, in the Department of Immunology or cell biology or something along those lines, or if you're a HSR researcher in the School of Public Health. Other factors to be thinking about, and this is obviously, again, depending upon the individual and their situation, the tenure clock, generally it's about 7 years for most institutions, but in this day and age with childcare factors, sometimes institutions may be more lenient and be able to allow you to extend that time based upon your needs. Other factors of how long your contract is good for, after how many years will it need to be renegotiated? Will you have funding for practice credentialing, such as state licenses, your DEA credentialing, et cetera? And whether in some situations, there are some campuses that have on-campus childcare for young children, and these may be long wait times, and this is something perhaps that's very important to you and maybe something that you need to negotiate for. And then the final area here, which is often less negotiable, these are often very much sort of in the fabric of the institution and much less likely to be able to change, or things like health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance, retirement programs, and perhaps asking for parking pass payment there. But again, it's just, if nothing else, you should be aware of the fact that all these are available, and you should be thinking about this in terms of your program. So as Dr. Freischlag said to me when I was starting to look for jobs at the end of my fellowship, show me the love or show me the money. And so this is where the negotiation comes in. So there's really what's been described as 5 different steps in the negotiation process. One being receiving the job offer and obviously responding intelligently, deciding if this is the right place for you. Might you be interested in accepting this? And if so, are you going to plan to negotiate? You need to be thinking about evaluating your and prioritizing your negotiation requests, and then begin negotiating, but making reasonable requests and being judicious about those requests until you finalize the offer letter. So once you get the job offer, obviously you want to be appreciative, you want to express enthusiasm, you want to take some time to think about it and talk with mentors and with family, et cetera, to really think about what's going to be right for you. And then once you've had some time to think about it, the goal is to respond with a prioritization of what you're going to need to be successful. So negotiation is not, the person that gets the most money or the most resources is the person that wins. It's really a matter of building a program around you and having a conversation that's going to provide you a successful environment to achieve your goals. This book here that's on the right side, Academic at Scientists Work, described that there was basically a rule of thumb that you can expect to sort of quote unquote win roughly about 5 points of a negotiation in your final offer letter. So again, you need to be judicious and be smart about what you're asking for. You need to be strategic in what you negotiate. And you need to be aware of the fact that email can actually provide some strategy in terms of delaying things. It gives you some time to respond. It gives you some time to think, some time to build in some discussion with mentors and trusted colleagues about what you should and shouldn't be asking for. And even if you're in the middle of a negotiation, you can always, end that and when at an appropriate time, and you can think about other things that you may need to ask for or that may be appropriate for your program. But in the end, you always want to ask for everything in writing in your final agreement. Obviously, there's stories of things changing over time. Sometimes, in unfortunate situations where a chair might change and the agenda of that chair might be different than the previous chair. That can potentially affect what your position is in terms of your research, clinical, teaching balance, et cetera. So make sure you get things in writing, and it will help you sort of in tough situations if those were to arise. Hopefully those won't, but just in the odd chance that they do, you have something to back you up. So in summary, what are the principles to follow? Approach the negotiation as a partnership. This is, again, not about getting the most. It's a matter of getting together a package that's going to make you successful. Remember, you're going to be working with these people. You're going to be, they're going to be mentoring you. They're going to be supporting you. You don't want to burn bridges or create animosity early on, based upon these interactions. Always be open and close your discussions with appreciation and enthusiasm. Negotiate with integrity. I said, this is not an ego trip, be willing to log roll or being able to give and take on points and balance both sides. Follow up your conversations with summaries of what you've discussed. Be sure to obtain everything in writing and really work towards situations that are going to be win-wins for both sides. And with that, this is a quote from Ron Vale. He was the chair of the Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine at UCSF for many years. He said, "Don't negotiate for the sake of negotiating, but do make sure you have what you need to succeed." And so with that, I will stop and say thank you and belated happy Halloween. And thank you very much all for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Siklik. That was just outstanding. And for the audience members, if you want to ask any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A or the chat, and Dr. Kaitan and I will address your questions at the end of the talks. And then jumping ahead to our next talk, it's Dr. Andrew Loewy from the University of California at San Diego also. Dr. Loewy is a professor of surgery and the chief of the Division of Surgical Oncology. He's also the co-chair of the NCI's Pancreas Cancer Task Force and the surgical liaison for the Pancreas and Hepatobiliary Committee for SWOG. He's also an NIH-funded surgeon scientist, and his talk is entitled, "What are the elements of a successful surgical research laboratory?" Dr. Loewy.
Great, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak at this webinar. It's a really great and important set of topics, and honored to have been asked. So I live in California, but I'm originally from New York, and I always like to start these kind of talks with this. A picture. I'm a diehard Yankee fan, and one of the famous quotes from Yogi Berra: "If you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else." And so I think that as you enter your surgeon scientist career, really, one of the hardest things is really thinking about what will it mean for you personally to be successful as you go through your career. And I think Jason started with a more esteemed person, Dr. Cameron, with his quote about loving your job. But I think this is really, I think we're both making the same point. And so, I think that personal honesty and really having personal insight is really a critical piece to being successful. And I raise this because I know that there are sometimes pressures for young faculty to pursue a research career or a certain type of research career that may not be exactly what they want to do. And so you really have to, first part about being successful in a research career is to really be doing the thing that you love. And so to really take stock as you're getting started about what you enjoy most, what you have enjoyed most through your training years, and to really be sure that you're going to focus on that, what fulfills you the most, what motivates you the most, what aligns with your own personal strengths, and what you are really willing to work as hard as possible on to improve and to maintain excellence. So, the ingredients of success, and I think you'll see all of these talks are going to overlap a bit, but my talk was about ingredients for success, and I'm just going to list them here on like the third slide, and then we'll talk about some other features of these as we go along. I think it's obvious that all of this involves a tremendous amount of hard work, and we as surgeon scientists are really having a dual career. We're being a clinician, and we're being a researcher. And obviously, PhD scientists dedicate their whole lives to their scientific career. Full-time clinicians devote their full time to a clinical career. And as many people have said to me, you're not twice as smart as them. So you have to really work hard. Jason mentioned mentoring, and Nita's going to have a whole talk about it, but it's critical. Can't ever be overemphasized enough. Personnel that, Jason mentioned, hiring in your laboratory, the people that you work with, both in your laboratory and in the clinic, really will in large part help determine your success. And you just heard about the financial resources necessary to be successful, as well as a little bit about bricks and mortar and infrastructure. But along with that, I will say that as you think about your research career and what you need to succeed, you need to understand if there's specific clinical resources that need to be present for you to be successful. And I always like to tell the story of when I came from MD Anderson to Cincinnati after my fellowship. And I had worked on a clinical trial with Doug Evans there, and I wanted to move that trial to Cincinnati, thinking I was going to do this great, pancreas cancer clinical trial that they did in Cincinnati, in Houston and in Cincinnati. And we opened the trial successfully. Unfortunately, there was no pancreas cancer program really there before I got there. And so there were hardly any patients. So it was a great trial, but we couldn't enroll nearly enough people. And so these are the types of things you have to think about, particularly if they're necessary for your basic research work. You need really smart people around you. Those are the people that you work with, people that you hire in your laboratory, as well as the people that you're going to interact with. You always want to try to embed yourself in an environment where I say the people are smarter than you if possible. So the first year when you are, a new faculty member and you're getting your laboratory, your research program started, really the first thing is about defining what your focus is. And when possible, as I've mentioned already, you want to try to align your clinical and research lives. So obviously, if, all of us, I think, speaking tonight are surgical oncologists, but regardless of whether you're, a surgeon who is studying some other non-oncologic aspect of gastrointestinal disease, you want to try to align your clinical practice so that it complements your research, so that you're always thinking about the same type of clinical problems. You really want to define what are your overarching goals, what's your big kind of career, your big goal for the next few years and then beyond. And so pancreas cancer is my passion. Really what I want to do is discover new therapies for patients. And when I started, there was an absence of genetically engineered models for the disease. And so that was my immediate, goal, was to help contribute to developing a genetically engineered model. And with the hypothesis that by using that model, as well as having access to human tissue, we might be able to provide a platform for discovery. And so here it says, own your surgeon self. And what that really means is take advantage of the fact that you are a surgeon, that you have unique access to patients and tissue that most PhD scientists will never have the kind of access you have. And that is your advantage. That is really something that makes you unique. And you really want to use that. You really want to own that, because it will be a key to your success. As far as mentoring, there's a few principles and I'm sure Nita will touch on some of these, but I'll go through them quickly. Jason talked about the mentoring team, and that's why I say make it plural. One mentor cannot fulfill all of your needs. You're a surgeon, you're a researcher. You want to have surgeon researchers as part of your team, but you also want to have research experts in some aspect of what you're studying. So for me, it was I needed to have a mentor who was a mouse geneticist and knew how to make mouse models. It may be that you need an immunologist or some particular aspect of cell biology. And so you want to have multiple mentors to fill in all of the specific needs that you have as you embark on your research career. You want someone who's had a track record of successful mentoring, people who have launched other people's careers successfully. You want that person to be confident and secure, to not be somebody who can look at you as a bright young person as a threat to them, but somebody who is totally confident in their own success and really is looking to buoy the success of of folks that they're mentoring. You want them to have good communication skills, and really you want them to have your best interests at heart, but this isn't the person who should be your best friend, because there involves difficult conversations that have to take place about how you're doing and so forth. They have to have time. They can be the greatest person in the world, but if they have 400 other commitments and 20 other mentees, that's probably not the best fit for you. When possible, if there's a way to align incentives, meaning having common research interests, that can be helpful. And you don't have to have all your mentors be at your institution. Mentors from outside your institution, they may be people that you trained with or met during the time you were presenting at a meeting. You should be very open to having mentors who are outside your institution. Setting up your day-to-day life. This is something that I think doesn't get talked about enough, but having an efficient daily schedule is critical to being successful. And geography really matters. If your department wants you to operate at 3 different hospitals, that's going to be really difficult. You're going to spend a lot of time just traveling from one place to another. If your lab and your clinic can be located as closely as possible, that's ideal. And having blocks of time that you can dedicate to your science is really, really valuable, as opposed to having 2 hours at the end of a day here, an hour there, et cetera. Jason just told you to negotiate for protected time, and that's what I was told. It was beaten into me as a fellow. And then when I went and started talking to Joe Fisher, who was my first boss, at our first discussion, I said, "Oh, I have to have protected time," as I was told to say. And he said to me, "There's no such thing as protected time." And I, of course, didn't know what to say after that. But as he explained to me, really what his point was, and I think it's a really valuable one, is that much of your time actually you have to protect, and that there are lots of different choices that you're going to have to make about things you want to get involved with. And so obviously there is going to be a requirement that you generate some amount of your income through your clinical practice, but there's lots of other activities, committees, institutional and department service, many other things that are going to pull at your time. And it really, whenever you say yes to something, you are also saying no to something else. And that can be saying no to time that you need for your science. So you really have to protect your own time. And I think that was a valuable, thing that Dr. Fisher imparted to me. So I thank Dr. Siklik for his donation of this slide, which I think is really a key and goes to what I spoke about before, which is that your research and your clinical programs can be highly synergistic, and in the ideal world, they really are. And so, Jason has done a terrific job doing that around his interest in GI stromal tumor. And, this just shows his growth of our program here and how it has buoyed his program by providing tissue samples to create cell lines and new models of the disease. And, really, this is, again, something where only surgeons can really, do this kind of thing, as efficiently and effectively as possible, and not having to necessarily rely on a host of collaborations to get this kind of thing done. So, the next thing is, as you are starting your lab, your research program, you have to build your team. And Jason talked about the people that you're going to hire. Usually, you're not going to have enough funds to hire 3 people. You're going to have enough funds to hire 1 person, maybe have a student, or a resident. And good people are everything. The C word, which is culture, it really does matter. You really have to establish a culture that's in keeping with your values. And to impart that and to talk about it. And, I talk about with my lab that we as a laboratory are focused on things that can be translated to patients, that, the culture of our laboratory is to be helpful to one another, respectful, et cetera. And so this, this is really something to establish from the get-go. As you're hiring, it's amazing how many people don't check references. But that's critically important to speak with somebody, to ask them pointed questions about the folks you're thinking about hiring. You want to ideally have, if you can, hire people with skills and knowledge that you lack to really complement you. And one of the features of folks is that you want to know that they've been able to work independently if you're hiring a tech, for instance. In students and trainees, the qualities that I value, obviously intellect, curiosity demonstrated during the interview process, and evidence of being a closer, meaning do they finish things that they've worked on, regardless of what it has been, but evidence that they are a finisher, that they get things done. So, as you develop your research, career, you want to have a plan. You want to have a plan that's based on how you are going to get funded, what is your roadmap, and you want to stick to it. You obviously want to focus in the first year on developing preliminary data. You want to create a list of intramural and extramural award opportunities, understand the details of them, when they're due, how long they have to be, do they have special requirements, like having a relationship to a community organization, for instance. And believe it or not, most institutions make it a priority to fund you as a young investigator. Most of them have many different programs to give money to you to get you started. And so make it easy for them by applying, and don't let these opportunities pass by. You want to meet with your mentors to discuss strategy around your larger, longer term goals, your immediate first large award. Are you somebody who should be applying for a K award? Are you sufficiently trained that you could apply for an R award right off the bat? VA awards if you have VA effort. And you want to look for early paths to publish your data when possible. You don't want to you want to avoid striving too high. You don't want your first paper doesn't have to be published in Nature or Cell. It's important that you get papers published. And so you don't want to hang on, say, well, when I get the next piece of data, I'm going to publish, because early publications are a really academic currency, and they are important for review committees as they evaluate you as a candidate. I love this, grants are like buses is a take on, Richard Branson's quote about business opportunities. There's always another one coming. There are many, many grant opportunities. Obviously, there's a cycle for most, for the NIH 3 times a year. And so, you want to plan ahead, well ahead for submissions. You want people to read your submissions. But if you're not quite ready, then you can wait for the next cycle. Obviously, you can't put that off forever, but grant opportunities, you can't feel like this is the only one I'm going to have. And the thing about grants really is that persistence is more important than brilliance. And the thing that's true about surgeon investigators is that they tend to not apply after being subjected to failure, to not being funded. That surgeons tend to, give up easier because there is a slippery slope to the clinic, which I'll mention again. So being persistent is key. And I say recycling isn't just for the environment. Recycling grants that you've written for one purpose to another funding agency is just smart and obviously uses the work that you've already done. So obviously always look to be able to do that. When you get grant reviews, listen to the reviewers. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, the things they point out are valid. And in order to get funded, you need to listen to those reviews, and you need to be responsive to them. That's a main review criteria, certainly for NIH. So, during your junior faculty years, obviously getting your first major grant is major. It's kind of the first sign of success, so to speak. However, you want to seek out as many opportunities as you can beyond that NIH grant. And these are just a few of them. Our surgical societies, including, SSAT, have grant programs. And obviously, as a surgeon, you're uniquely qualified to apply for those. Jason pointed out, and has been very successful working with patient advocacy groups, as well as patients who are willing to often give you philanthropic donations for your research. And that can really be very helpful to support you as you're trying to get your first award. As I mentioned, you have to really avoid the slippery slope into clinical quicksand, which is, it's very easy for us to get comfortable, in the clinic and build practices that start to suck up all your time. And this is where personal honesty is really important about your, what you really are most passionate about. But if you start to use up all of your available time in the clinic, your likelihood of being successful as an investigator is going to greatly diminish. And the other thing to really keep in mind is that the first major grant you get, it is a great accomplishment, but really it's an opportunity, because that's what sets the stage for your career. That isn't your career. That's just the very beginning of your career. And so sustainability is really about having a successful research career. And, one of the keys, I think, is really listening to your own data. Some people get married to their hypothesis, to their protein of interest, et cetera, when the data is telling them, look, your hypothesis just isn't right. This is not as important as you thought it was. And so you have to really be open-minded about your science. You need to keep up on the literature, and it's easy to not do that when you're busy, but you can't read enough. You want to go to the relevant meetings, not just surgical meetings, but scientific meetings around your focus of interest. You really need to make time to think, to just think about, about your research in quiet, with others, with your lab group, with your collaborators. You need to keep your science fresh because, like I said, the first grant is only the first grant. The next grant, there has to be something new. And you really want to obviously always be working on solutions to problems that are going to be impactful. So I say, if your significance section is hard for you to write, then you have an issue because that should write itself about why what you're doing is important. And I like to talk about the T's as far as the ways to be innovative. Innovation is a review criteria for the NIH and most grant societies. Are you using innovative tools for your research? Are you using tissue, which is innovative in and of itself many times? Are you using innovative techniques or technology? And so you always want to have a component of this in your science because it will set you apart from others. And you can never collaborate enough. Team science really is the way the best science gets done these days. Having the more collaborators, the better, to keep you fresh, to teach you new things, and to really, because it's absolutely just the most fun. And finally, this quote, which I'm sure everybody has seen, but I think is a great one, which is that success is the ability to go from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm. And obviously grant writing is fraught with failure, but you just can't let it get you down, because few failures are really fatal. You just have to assess them honestly, help by seeking out the opinions of your mentors and collaborators, retool, tweak, change your direction, and generally with persistence, you'll be successful. So in conclusion, you really want to think about and find your passion and follow it. Be flexible, open to opportunities and collaborations. Find strong mentors and really use them. Persistence, again, wins the day. It is really perhaps the most important quality of people who are successful as surgeon scientists. Focus your science on quality and innovation. Make sure that you present and publish your work and collaborate freely. And most of all, you have to really enjoy it, because that's really what it's all about. So I will stop there. I appreciate the opportunity to speak and look forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you, Dr. Loewy. That was just outstanding. And we'll go to our final speaker. And our final speaker is Dr. Nita Ahuja from Yale University. Dr. Ahuja is a professor of surgery and the chair of the Yale Department of Surgery and the interim cancer center director at Yale. In addition to being an NIH-funded surgeon scientist, which studies biomarkers in pancreas and colon cancer, she's also a very fierce advocate for the surgeon scientists and surgical mentees. Dr. Ahuja? I think it's on mute, Dr. Ahuja.
How's that?
I can hear you. Yep, that's great.
Okay. Well, it's hard to follow those two speakers. I mean, I think there were a lot of pearls in there, so this is going to be a tough act to follow, but I will talk a little bit about the role of mentorship. And as Saj said, that the role of surgeon scientist is one that something that I've really felt that surgeons have a lot to give in terms of solving tough problems, because we see them in the OR every day. So I don't think the disclosures matter, but here are the mandatory disclosures. And I apologize, I did not put it in the SSAT background. So mentorship is, as a definition, is a process whereby an experienced and highly regarded empathetic person guides another person, individual, in the development and re-examination of their own ideas, learning, and personal and professional development. So I want to make sure that you pay attention that there's a push and a pull in this relationship. And mentorship as a theory is, I think, fundamental to what we would say is our academic mission. But formal mentorship has only been introduced recently in the late 90s. Both LCME and ACGME have formal mentorship requirements. But I would say that programs and guidelines of faculty are very poorly established. And the data actually, once you start diving in, we talk a lot about it. We don't measure it as to what is good mentorship and what is bad mentorship. I think most of us recognize it, but perhaps don't really give you formal tools. But it is recognized as an important catalyst for research success. I think skill acquisition, learning techniques. If you are in the bench, sometimes it is learning genomic skills. If it's health services research, maybe understanding how do you collate big data and combine it with other things. So there's a skill acquisition. I think often mentors also help you in the institutional environment and connecting and making the nodes for not only for them, but also for you. And then also an important but poorly understood thing is that they teach you about research integrity and professionalism and what we consider our mission. So this is interesting. This is looking at all of academic sort of different programs. This includes nursing, law, and we talk a lot about mentorship in law schools, in nursing, in medicine. They looked at 106 articles over a really long period, looked at 14 studies only that measured mentorship. And they looked at mean effect size, look at the bottom panel and tells you what the effect of mentorship is, and also on other things such as income, et cetera. So I think it tells you that there's an effect of mentorship. They measured it as 0.24, but also there are other outcomes like job satisfaction, self-esteem, promotion, tenure, career advancement, et cetera. So mentorship appears to be important when we measure it, at least in a lot of fields. It seems to be that there may be data that suggests that. This is an article that looks around more in medicine. It's published in academic medicine in JAMA, and looks at a meta-analysis of 140 studies, only about which they selected about 40, and then ended up with only a handful of studies that looked at the role of mentorship. Mentorship definitely improves self-confidence. You're more likely to allocate more time in research if you have a dedicated mentor. I think these are important points, that there's data that you actually end up having more publications. And what is probably important to this conversation is when they measured, who's most likely to get funded, that having a mentor, the odds ratio of you getting a grant is about 2.1 to 3.1. So, we're all very data centric. So I think that's helpful. I think we all enjoy having a mentor and gives greater career satisfaction, more likely to pursue academic career. But this is the important point, that lack of mentorship is thought to be a greatest barrier to career development, especially amongst women. And 95% of the people in these studies scored time with mentor as extremely important or important characteristic of research training. So why do we focus on this session? I think we can all say that, physician scientist is one, especially surgeon scientist. The number of funded surgeon scientists is declining. And like Dr. Loewy said, you don't need one mentor, you need many mentors. And I'll talk a little bit about that, about why we as surgeons especially may have more barriers to cover and may need multiple types of mentors. So this is a paper that looked at K awardees. So now it is surgeons who did get funded, and it's 10-year survey of K awardees from surgery departments. You can look at the individual characteristics and environmental characteristics. And what appears is there are many important pieces, certainly, as Dr. Loewy mentioned, personal traits. I would say drive or perseverance are important characteristics, institutional environment, and some of it is money, but also that the institution is supported and supports physician scientists clearly is important, but mentorship comes up as part of this. And when they looked at this, there was the response rate about 60% of the 144 people. What is interesting is still we do have more MDs than MD PhDs, only 31% women. But what is striking is there's no African American or Hispanic in this group. And I think when we look at some of the data says that perhaps it's unclear if mentorship works for everybody. So whatever I may say, just imagine that a lot of this may be more relevant for men and the data on women. And then especially as we look at our African American or Hispanics may be hard to gather. Certainly on these grants, the usual expectations, more basic science, lens health services, and then the phenotypes of people who get funded surgeon, as mentioned by tonight, trauma and then vascular transplant. But again, thematic areas that come up, environment, protected time or time allocation, and then mentorship comes up as. So again, the data seems to be that mentorship is important in many fields, and surgeons seem to feel we're funded that it's important. This is a paper we wrote now several years ago looking at what are the constituencies, and I think Dr. Loewy talked about environment, Jason Siklik talked about financial support, we talked about social support, and no one's talking about that, but I would not underestimate the importance of having a supportive division for surgeons, that your division looks out for you as you're writing a big grant deadline. But committed mentors are critical, and things we mentioned in this is experienced investigator. Someone who is an expert in their field is definitely one of your main scientific mentor. They have to be committed into mentoring. And then a network of mentors sometimes is something we all talk about, that some of them are life mentors, some are subject matter mentors, and some are peer mentors. So what is the responsibility of a mentor? I mentioned, this is the way I sort of think about it, that they teach you research part, like how to do research. So some of it is research skills. They are often important in telling you disciplinary knowledge. By the time you see something innovative in a paper, I usually tell my mentees that's already outdated. So you need to be in the field, and your mentors often are in the field. So really they keep you connected at what's coming at you. They also teach you about research integrity. It's an important part, that scientific integrity and the data, much of the data we know sometimes can't be replicated. And they also kind of keep us honest, that are you really effective in what you're doing? If your mentor is not doing that, they're not helping you. There's some interpersonal parts that they help you with in setting up expectations, and that is aim high, goal setting, what is realistic. And then this is perhaps hard, but critical, honest, high quality feedback. Because certainly if they don't give it to you, the reviewers will definitely give it to you. So you really want to hear it from your mentors. Is your grant over ambitious and it's bound to fail? And then the more poorly understood, but especially as we feel in the first few years as a faculty, where there you have so many things, you're trying to set up your clinical practice, manage work-life balance. They also are helpful in thinking about our careers and the joys of academic medicine, and how do you balance this tightrope of doing science and setting up a clinical practice. I think it's important that they also be sponsors. I suspect most of this audience is well aware that sponsorship is taking you into a larger role, which is very visible. Sometimes it can be putting you up for this national talk that now makes you a subject matter expert, that they think about you in those spaces. And of course, especially paying attention to culturally responsive women. For the women physician scientists, there's been a lot written during COVID that women have taken an inordinate burden on childcare, and it's affecting research productivity for them. So I think just understanding that we no longer have the traditional hierarchy of how we think about it, and our academic medicine and careers are very diverse, that our mentors also reflect that. So how do you find a good mentor? They should be knowledgeable. I think that's probably important. And as many people have said, you probably have a team. I remember on my first K grant, I had a subject matter expert, Steve Balin, who's kind of often considered a guru of epigenetics, but I had a clinical mentor, Steve Leach, who kind of helped me understand how do you manage it with a PhD mentor? What do I need to do as a surgeon? A mentor also not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. That is, there is a defined history of mentees, and you can see that they were successful. Not only that there's a lot of people in their lab, but I often see, do their mentees go on and stay in academia? If none of them are staying in academia, that's a red flag. Do they respond to your needs when you're distressed? Are they listening to that? and what you really need in your career. They care about you and your success, and not only of you as someone in their laboratory that they're using you for their research. They provide guidance and also maybe forcefully push back. I remember when I got really busy early on as a surgeon, Steve Balin took me aside, and we often met Friday nights and said, you can always be a busy surgeon. If you want to do research, you need to focus on your research career, because the early years are critical. And I think you're hearing that thematically from all of us. Pushing you to think about your favorite hypothesis, maybe saying that may not be realistic, is often hard but critical. And then recognized as having a mentee, as I said, who's attained professional and personal goal. They've shown them those opportunity. And another way of thinking of effective mentors is they're strategic. They kind of give you career advancement. They help you navigate politics. I think academic medicine is full of political pitfalls, and helping you, especially in bigger organizations, how do you manage that? And also providing radical candor is an underappreciated part of a mentor. I think anyone who's a mentor is often unselfish, because this is, although there may be some visible parts like having a paper, there's a lot of work, and they are committed to it because they're fundamentally altruistic. I think it's important to make sure that there's no obvious conflict between you and your mentor. And if we have time, we can talk it at the end, because certainly at some point you will outgrow your mentor, and it's okay, because then you may become colleagues. And it's perfectly reasonable over time that your mentor now becomes a colleague. And then do they mentor diverse mentees? Are they from different varied interests? Because I think you learn from also their mentees. Curiosity is not just, the learned skills of knowledge are not just from top down, but also peer mentoring. And you want to make sure that group is diverse. Okay, what are mentee responsibilities? You have to, of course, find a suitable mentor and focus areas. And I know one of my physician scientists had multiple mentors when I came, and I saw her and I said, well, who's your main mentor? And it took us about 1.5 years to identify who her main mentor was. In fact, the surgeon then embedded themselves in that laboratory and has gotten a K and is writing their R. The mentee should be reliable and committed, showing up to meetings. Just because you work long hours doesn't mean it's the mentor's responsibility to work in your schedule. So, just because you want to have a meeting at 6:30 doesn't mean it works for your mentor, and you have to be cognizant of that. You are prepared for the meeting. If you said you were going to do something, you show up having done that. You also assess your own skills and goals. Of course, you're receptive, and it's a mindset that's willing to learn. And then be honest, tell your mentor what you really want to do, not what you think they want to hear. I think I heard Andy say that. A lot of people think that if I tell my boss I really want to be a physician scientist, but really I love operating, they'll be honest. I think sometimes it's, we sort of are not explicit around those things. So this is kind of a similar piece of thinking about the mentoring skill model. It's a partnership. And I think the word cloud is helpful on the right. The mentor listens, is patient, pushes you for scientific skills. It's available, but the mentee is curious, motivated, proactive, hard worker, rigor, but also has flexibility, is just perhaps some of the parts of this relationship. And this is perhaps also what I like, is that new age mentorship is active. It's not like you go and have a mentorship session. I've never done that. I think sometimes mentorship happens in corridors, sometimes happens as you meet a subject matter expert and only see them on national meetings. It's often personalized. It follows the mentee's vision and incorporates technologies. That is, we often, especially with Zoom, you can have a conversation with your mentor far away in another area. And a lot of my mentors, as I moved from Hopkins to Yale a few years ago, a lot of my mentees are many spaces, and the same for them. So I think it's an opportunity to think. I love peer mentorship. I think it's a great idea. And this is a brilliant paper for those of you who like networks. And on the table one, what you see is if you have 4 residents and they start peer mentoring, the first year only the first person is a subject matter expert. But the second year, everyone is supporting each other, and now you have much more productivity. And 5 years later, you can see the numbers, the network increases. And that's because, especially if all of you are really different, One of my best friends is a peer mentor. She's just a couple of years behind me. She's a medical oncologist, runs the phase 1 group, and we support each other. She knows I'm a surgeon, take big picture. She's a clinical trialist. So we learn from each other all the time and have done that for 10 years and would still consider ourselves peer mentors to each other. Now, I think the other part to think about is for mentors, how do we say it's nice to have a mentor, but how are we supporting them? Because it's their time. So sometimes institutions may give them awards, but there's no compensation for their time. But I think sometimes universities and institutions will do that tactically, where they'll give mentors lab space. So as a department, I tend to give mentors lab space for their mentees, because if they're mentoring my trainees, and we'll do that with other departments. If we know someone wants to work in another department, we'll support the mentor. So there's a mutual incentive to do well. And then helping also help the mentor with formal training. A lot of institutions are starting to do that. How do you work with different types of people? Can we acknowledge mentors and promotions and use that? Some people are starting to talk about that. I already talked about peer network. And then also maybe we should teach people how to be good mentors. So what can we think about as individuals? We should find, we say that we should think about mentoring others, because, if you want to be mentored, pay it back. And then look for different types of mentors for departments. Many departments try to build structured mentorship program. I think we can talk about sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. They work more for sort of tools, tactical type things, but not for lifelong things. I think celebrating mentor-mentee relationships. So if you have a great mentor, celebrate them, mention them in meetings as acknowledging them. I think you heard every one of the people talk about their mentors. And I think that helps continue the relationship. Institutionally, think about, as you look for your job, how is the institution doing that? But is the chair thinking about, or your division chief helping you find those mentors? If they're not, and is it your entire job to figure out who the mentors are? How will you do that as you land in a new organization where you don't? So I think Saj knows this. We are at the same institution. We'll often make sure here, these are the 5 or 7 people you may want to meet. And then what we'll do is often facilitate on the back end some financial and also structured relationships. And then I think certainly nationally, there's programs certainly like SSAT that are trying to create more informal mentorship to help us. So with that, I'd rather leave more time for questions and answers, and we can chat more about some of these things. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Thanks to all the attendees for coming tonight. I realize it's late and we're running over time, but we'll take another 5 or 7 minutes just to conclude. But thank you to all the speakers. These were phenomenal talks. I wish I would have heard your talks when I was in training, so I would have been set up for more success. There are a couple of poll questions that are put out. If you guys, the attendees, can answer the 2 questions. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead and ask the Q&A question. There was a question that was asked from Dr. Hassan, a very relevant question about negotiating for something like money during a first job with the chairman can be intimidating. Can that be perceived negatively, and how to avoid this? And Dr. Siklik, you answered that, but if we all can weigh in a little bit, would be nice.
Yeah, I mean, Nita, you want to go maybe as the chair?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that since I'm the chair. I think negotiating is a partnership. Remember, this is not a car salesman. You're going to see this person. So it's a fine knack of negotiating. And I tend to negotiate for things that really matter to me. So know yourself and don't negotiate so that it becomes a painful exercise. But if you're genuine and know yourself, if you ask for things like resources, I think it's perfectly legitimate to ask for those resources because we want you to succeed. And if you haven't thought about it and are asking for things, then I almost think that you don't know what you're talking about. So if you have done your due diligence and are asking for a financial startup package, I'm okay with that. I think sometimes some people will over negotiate and make it like, extract the last dollar. And if you're successful, there's going to be a lot more pieces. Having said that, whatever goes in the business in your contract is finally important. So those things are things like your salary, your startup package, to make sure that it's there in your contract and also what your clinical effort is. Those things are often protected by schools by the legal office, and I think those are critical to make sure that the chair is paying attention, because sometimes chairs leave, deans leave, so it's okay with that. But please don't go and negotiate the parking spot, because it starts to get to a point of, are you interested in being successful, or are you interested in negotiating because you went to a negotiating course?
Now, I would say with respect to salary, these days, there's a lot of attention at most institutions to equity. And so there's not a situation where, it's not the chair's or the department's interest to try to get you for $30,000 a year below market. Like Nita said, this isn't a car sales. So usually they're going to make you an offer that's basically at the level of what, the institution or the department has been offering people at your level, whether you did a fellowship, et cetera. There's always some room for negotiation based on market. I mean, I can tell you, in the past when I've recruited, some people, if they have a skill set that's in particular demand, that's in particular interest to me to have, and they're a very limited phenotype, and they have another offer that is a little bit above what we're offering, then, it's reasonable to say, look, I do have another offer, but that has to be, you can't negotiate just to negotiate. Like we've said, if you're going to ask for $10,000 more, it has to be because if they give you that to you, you're going to go there. It's not a game. And so it is reasonable to ask for a little bit more if you have, a more competitive offer, if you're really interested in that institution. But the worst thing you can do is to be playing games with several different institutions and, just to get a few $1,000s more. That's really not going to be something that's going to, be looked upon well by anybody. So I think negotiation is fair within limits, but these days you're going to get a fair offer usually right at the get-go. And there's going to be a little bit of wiggle room above that, but not a lot.
I think adding on to what Andy was saying, I mean, it's a small world, it's a small community, and burning bridges over small amounts of money is not worth it in the long run.
Great, thank you. Do you guys think if, say, you weren't successful with your first job and you didn't get the things that you wanted, do you think you have any leverage to ask this when you look for a second job?
I want to understand the question. You mean that when you had your first job, you didn't negotiate well, and then you're negotiating for a second job?
Or if you're switching jobs and you're 4 years into practice or 5 years, and you're not happy with the first job because they didn't live up to what you were saying. Is it an appropriate thing to ask a second time?
Well, I think, when you're going to another place, you're going to be judged on what you've accomplished and what your promise is to your new job. They're not going to reward you because somebody else didn't give you something. They just care about the here, now, and the future. And so they will compensate you according to what they think your value is. And, if you went and you were unsuccessful in building a research program and you're saying, well, I want to have a do-over, you're going to have to give a very compelling argument as to why, they should give that to you. If you can do that successfully, then great. But, unfortunately, nobody's going to give you something because you didn't get it before. That's not what it's about.
There's a second question in the chat box that from Dr. Batra. To ensure mentee-mentor relationship is constantly successful, is it advisable to set certain short, medium, and long-term objective goals for that relationship? Or is it better to just leave that in a fluid form with constant pull-push approach as the relationship matures?
Nita, you want to take that one as a mentoring?
Yeah, sure. I think absolutely you should. I mean, all faculty should have an annual review and set 1, 3, and 5-year goals. So absolutely, please set those goals and then review them. This is part of being a good mentee, that you're reviewing those goals and creating alignment with what is realistic. So no, don't leave it fluid, because then no one knows what you're thinking, and mentor thinks you're applying for a K grant and you're thinking I'm very busy and I'm going to apply 2 years from now when I get my clinical practice set up. You have problems. So no, the other part, once you set those and review them prospectively, right? Keep them as a living document in front of you. And if it's not going to schedule, then be very critical and find out why it's not going on schedule. Because the fluidity comes in figuring out perhaps that, COVID pandemic hit and my institution was shut down. So you have to then reset your goals because a lot of labs were shut down. So I think, but absolutely, you should be looking at your 1 and 3 and 5 year goals. I think anything beyond that becomes unrealistic, but I encourage every faculty member to do that, both for the clinical life and the research. And one thing I would say for surgeon scientists, especially if your mentor is not a surgeon, and that's often typical for the bench scientist, is make sure they understand your clinical goals too. There's often a disconnect, and if they don't know this, they're not going to understand. And I'll give you, Julie Freischlag hired me as my first faculty job, and my mentor was Steve Balin, and he actually went and advocated to Julie for me on my behalf for keeping me. So we always made sure that, not only was my mentor vested in me, but then he went to my boss and advocated. So I think listen, your success is their success. So don't underestimate that. Again, this is more relational rather than a financial piece. It's how are you building and boosting that relationship over time with your mentor.
We had taken a poll about how many attendees were what stage in their career. And it appears that less than 20% of the attendees were in their training phase. So it would be nice to target these webinars for them so that they know exactly what to ask for their startup package, how to set themselves up for success as surgeon scientists. So maybe in the future, we should do these webinars and target that audience better. Evening webinar would be attended by them, but then there are people who are in the first 5 years. So at least we've targeted them. Any other questions from anyone?
I think the parting thoughts, which I think Dr. Loewy mentioned, Jason mentioned, I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in surgeons as partners in schools of medicine. So don't restrict yourself to your department. Seek out complementary mentorship where your perceived things, timing in the OR is actually a skill set. So I think that's the piece that perhaps we don't talk about. And there's a lot of big world out there, and they're looking for surgeons as committed partners for research with them.
Great. Thank you. I think we're over time.
Okay.
Thanks to
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Everybody.
Bye. Good night,
Bye.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.